I guess it's 9:30 my time and the start of this session. So I'll start by introducing Kate, who is our first speaker. Uh, Professor Kate Saenko is an associate professor of computer science at Boston University and a consulting professor for the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab. She leads the computer vision and learning group at BU, is the founder and co-director of the Artificial Intelligence Research Initiative, and a member of the Image and Video Computing Research Group. Kate received her PhD from MIT and did her postdoctoral training at UC Berkeley and Harvard. Her research interests are in the broad area of artificial intelligence with a focus on dataset bias, adaptive machine learning, learning for image and language understanding, and deep learning. Thank you, Kate, for agreeing to give a talk at this workshop, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Great, thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me to this workshop. And good morning or good afternoon, depending on where everyone is. So I wanted to talk about some of our work in sort of issues related to data shift in the various forms that it can take. So the title of my talk is Data Shift Happens, What to Do About It, which means that data shift is very prevalent and inevitable. In fact, it happens in pretty much every practical application of machine learning computer vision. So the real question is, what can we do about data shift? What are the strategies that we can use to mitigate it? And so I want to start by motivating why we are doing the research that we're doing. And essentially, the reason is labeling cost and availability of data, right? So if we could collect a large enough data set, labeled data set for any problem that we want to solve that covers all possible kinds of input data that we might encounter or our machine learning model might encounter in the world, then we probably wouldn't be doing this kind of research. But the reality is that collecting and labeling data is very costly. It's costly in terms of money, it's costly in terms of time, sometimes not possible because our categories are very long-tailed, so it's just very hard to find the right data to label, or maybe the data is private. So there are all kinds of issues around getting enough data sets. And so what that presents us with is a problem of data set bias, meaning that your data set that your model is trained on is always going to be biased in one shape or form with respect to the real data that you will encounter. So for example, you might be training your pedestrian detector on sunny streets of California, and then you might ask your model to label not so sunny, maybe snowy or foggy or rainy streets of northeastern US. And that's going to cause the model to fail and mislabel things because it's not trained on this exact kind of input data. So we call this data set bias, or another term for it is domain shift. Right. So the problem with this domain shift is that the input data in training looks different from the input data at test time. We call this source versus target domains. And really, the vast majority of data sets that we have is this I.I.D. data concept of I.I.D. testing, right? So we collect some data set, label it, and then we sample an I.I.D. training set and an I.I.D. test set. We train on the training set and test on the I.I.D. test set, and then we declare victory, right? Like, oh, our model beats all these other models, great, good for us, right? But in reality, that improvement we're getting on the I.I.D. test set is very likely to disappear as soon as the model is presented with out of distribution data, right? So it's essentially we're overestimating the generalization capability of our model, and the solution to this is to test everything we have on out of distribution data, right? So with O.O.D. testing, we want to train on multiple types of input data sets, right? Let's say rain, sun, and fog. And then we want to test on a held out type of data set, let's say snow, that the model hasn't been trained on. And that will be a much better estimate of how well our model generalizes in terms of its accuracy. So the reality is that data set shift and O.O.D data always reduces accuracy of modern approaches. Some more than others, but this is a picture from a paper we wrote over 10 years ago, where if you train on this top data set and test on the bottom data set, the accuracy drops very significantly. This was pre-deep learning, but even after deep learning, the situation is not much better. So for example, in this paper from a few years ago, the authors trained the model on ImageNet and then tested on ImageNet version 2, which is the same data collection, the same categories, this collected the same way, but just a little later than the original ImageNet. And they also saw a very significant drop in accuracy from this seemingly, very small shift in the input domain. Another problem that I want to address today is that of rare domains, right? So ImageNet is somehow representative of data you would see, like kind of objects you might see on the web. But there are many kinds of downstream tasks we might want to work on and solve that are not like ImageNet, right? So medical images, chest x-rays, sketch data is not quite like ImageNet. There are some fine-grained or maybe biological or botanical data sets, such as flower classification, text and numbers, satellite imagery. So these are all sort of, I call them rare domains, meaning that it's rare to find them on the web, which is where we draw most of our training data from. And then another problem I want to talk about is unseen categories. So here we have a certain number of categories we're training on, such as the 1,000, let's say in ImageNet, but at test time, we get some previously unseen categories. And then we either want to classify them, even though we hadn't been trained on them, right? So like, is this picture of this tree an ash tree? Or is it some other type of tree, right? So ash, may not have been a label during our pre-training. Can we somehow infer whether this new kind of category is present in the image? So that's called zero-shot classification, of course. But another way that we may want to deal with unseen categories is to ignore them, right? So if we trained our model on some data with n categories, and then we see n+1 categories, we don't want that to break our model. We want to be able to reject these novel categories and still have our model perform well on the n categories that it's trained on. So the plan for today is to talk about some solutions to these problems that I outlined. So starting with learning from less labeling, we're going to talk about open match, which is a way to do semi-supervised learning with outlier categories. Then I'll talk about simulation, pre-training for rare domains. Then I'll talk about a bit about zero-shot classification problems. And then I'll finish by talking about this idea of, does pre-training matter for handling distribution shift? Does pre-training on large-scale models, training larger models, does that have an effect on generalization to novel domains? Okay, so the first paper I'll mention is called Open Match, Open Set Consistency Regularization for Semi-Supervised Learning with Outliers. This is joint work with my students, Kuniaki Saito and Donyun Kim. And the problem that we're solving here is semi-supervised learning with outlier classes, right? So in semi-supervised learning, we have some labeled data and a bunch of unlabeled data. And so the problem we're posing here is, what if the unlabeled data had unknown categories in it, right? So in that tree example I showed, maybe we know of certain trees, but then the unsupervised data has other trees that we don't have labels for. So how can we deal with this issue when we're training a model in the semi-supervised fashion? So the sort of, at least at the time we wrote the paper, the state-of-the-art method was fixed match. And so the fixed match approach is shown here. It's a pseudo labeling method. So it takes unlabeled samples, performs a weak augmentation, a strong augmentation, and then enforces this sort of consistency between predicted labels of the weakly augmented sample and the strongly augmented sample. But the problem with fixed match is that it can't deal with the outlier classes that I was mentioning, right? So we propose our approach called open match. Open stands for, it's a play on fixed match, but with open world assumptions of open unknown categories. And the solution is basically a fairly straightforward idea that we're going to add an outlier detector to fixed match, right? So the idea here is, in addition to the pseudo labeling, we're also going to reject outlier categories. So for example, if dogs are not in our labeled set, we want to reject them because they're an unknown category, and it shouldn't be affecting our known category training. And then the other contribution here is that we're adding a consistency regularization for the outlier detector as well, right? So not just the main pseudo labeling branch, but also the outlier detector should have consistency regularization, right? So the way this works is we have an unlabeled sample, which becomes augmented in two ways. The features are extracted. Just going to make my pointer visible. We extract the features, and then the outlier detector predicts some anomaly score for each category, right? So is this image likely an anomaly relative to each category we know about? So we want to regularize and make these consistency scores from the two augmented versions of the image. We want them to be consistent. So right, so this is these are some results from the paper, just to show us one table, not going to go into a lot of detail. So here we're doing, we're sort of evaluating on CFAR 10, which is a standard benchmark for semi-supervised learning, with varying numbers of labeled samples per class. This is known classes, right? It's 50, 100, 400. And for each one, we compare training only on labeled data. So for example, only on 50 labeled samples per class, not using any unlabeled data. And here our unlabeled data has some outlier classes. Right, so we split CFAR 10, which has 10 categories, into 6 inlier and 4 outlier classes. So you can see that with 50, we have labeled only performance in terms of accuracy. Fixed match actually gets worse than labeled only, so it doesn't even improve by using the unlabeled data. And then MTC is another baseline, and then our method open matches in green is improving relative to MTC. And there's a similar story for more samples per class, although the gap becomes smaller as we head into 400 labels per class. And we can also look at the feature distributions after training and compare sort of supervised training, where you can see the pink points are all the unknown categories, and they're kind of spread all over the place and becoming confused with the known categories. And compare that to open match, which separates known from unknown categories. Again, by doing this outlier detection that I was talking about. All right. So by the way, if anyone has questions, maybe you can just unmute because it's hard for me to see any chat here. Or
I actually had a question. Can I ask it right now?
yeah, go ahead.
On the previous slide, you mentioned that you have two separate augmentations for the images augmented in two ways. Does the choice of augmentation affect the performance, and like how do you choose what transformations you use? Because it seems to make a huge difference in like SSL algorithms. Certain papers have shown that the choice of augmentation sort of makes a huge difference. So I guess I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Thank you for the question. Yeah, so the main SSL algorithm we're using is still fixed match, which has this weak and strong augmentation, as you mentioned. The augmentation matters here. So having these two kinds of augmentations performs better in practice for SSL. But for our soft consistency regularization, we're actually not doing anything fancy, and we haven't tried too many different ways of augmenting. We're just doing kind of different cropping and very standard kinds of augmentations. But I think it's a good question to maybe for follow-up work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. So unless there are any other questions about the open match, also happy to wait until the end. I have 30 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, maybe I have to speed up actually if I have 30 minutes. So I want to talk about simulation for rare domains. So this is a paper that was presented at CVPR this year called Task to Sim. And it's joint work with a bunch of folks that you can see here. So the idea here is if we have these rare domains that are not like ImageNet or are not like our web scale datasets, can we customize the pre-training data to improve performance? Or in fact, can we just simulate the training data? So that's the idea behind this work, is that we're going to generate custom pre-training data purely by simulating it. So we're not going to use any real data. We're not going to use ImageNet. So the synthetic pre-training data looks like this. We are essentially kind of trying to approximate something like ImageNet because we have different objects on varying backgrounds, and we can move the objects around. We can randomize certain parameters such as their size in the image, their textures, the kind of lighting that we have in the scene. And so after we generate the synthetic data, we pre-train a model, and then we fine-tune or use linear probing on some downstream tasks that you can see here. And these tasks, there are 20 tasks, and they vary in their closeness to ImageNet. Some are closer and some are quite far away. And so one thing we notice is the downstream task accuracies are different depending on which parameters we randomize for generating the synthetic data. So for example, by adding blur, we perform better on satellite, but worse on sketches and so on. So this idea that task-specific simulation is better for downstream task performance is what motivated this approach that we call task to sim. So the idea here is that we're going to be given some task embeddings, and we're going to learn which are the best optimal simulation parameters for each task. So the first thing to do is project each task into an embedding, which we use task2vec for. This is a previous work. And then we feed that embedding to our task to sim model that predicts the simulation parameters. So this is a binary vector that says, should we simulate pose variation, should we simulate lighting variation, and so on. And you can see here, hopefully you can see the animation that shows the effect of varying each of these parameters. There are more than 4 in our data set, but I'm just showing 4 here for illustration. right? So things like backgrounds, varying lighting, colors, textures, and so on. Okay, so then these parameters are fed into the generator, which then produces the synthetic image data set. And then to train the model, the test-to-sim model itself, we're going to evaluate these pre-training data sets by actually pre-training classifiers and evaluating them. So this is all happening in the loop. And then we evaluate quickly using KNN. So this is a fast way of evaluating a model, and that gives us a reward to train the test-to-sim parameters. Okay. So again, just briefly, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but we evaluate performance of how well this synthetic pre-training generalizes to tasks not encountered in training test-to-sim. So we split our tasks into seen and unseen tasks. And you can see here that when we compare, so these are different ways of evaluating on downstream tasks, such as k-nearest neighbors with 5 nearest neighbors, linear probing, or fine-tuning. And compared to ImageNet pre-training, we see that performance is actually fairly close for KNN, or even better for linear and fine-tuning. So this is with 100 classes. As we increase the number of classes, we still maintain a small improvement on ImageNet pre-training, which is, I think, quite promising, considering that we're just simulating all of our data. We're not using any real data for pre-training. And the nice thing about that is you can avoid having privacy issues, or having like this difficulty of collecting real data that I talked about. Okay. Great. So the next thing I want to talk about is zero-shot recognition. So this paper is called Dual Co-op. It's being presented at NeurIPS this year. And it's titled Fast Adaptation to Multi-Label Recognition with Limited Annotations. It's joint work with my students, Shumang and Ping. So in multi-label recognition, we want to classify an image as having multiple categories, right? So instead of just picking a single category that we do in standard multi-class classification and multi-label classification, we're interested in predicting if each of a long set of categories is present in each image, right? So here we might have labels for cat and bird, but also we might have only partial labels because a lot of categories may just not be annotated. For example, fence is not annotated in this image. So that presents an extra difficulty in multi-label recognition. And what we're actually addressing is the task of zero-shot multi-label recognition, right? So in zero-shot multi-label recognition, we're given training images of n known categories that are both fully and partially labeled. And we want to predict novel objects or if they're present in the input image. So these are unseen at training time. And the approach that we're taking is based on CLIP. So CLIP is a very powerful zero-shot model, which pre-trains a text encoder and an image encoder on large amounts of web text with images, paired with images. And then to do zero-shot classification, you can feed it a prompt that says a photo of a blank, and you replace the blank with the name of the object, for example, dog. And then the image encoder also can encode the images, the input image, and then comparing the text and image encoding, we can produce a score of how well this category matches this image, essentially. But the downside of CLIP is that it's not designed for multi-label classification, or at least not as fully optimized as it could be, which is what we show in this paper. So in our approach in Dual Co-op, we harness these powerful pre-trained vision language models, but we optimize them for multi-label classification with this key idea of dual prompts, right? So as I mentioned, there's a prompt to the text encoder, which consists of a bunch of tokens followed by the class token, for example, animal, if we want to classify if an animal is present. And in our paper, we propose learning these tokens. So the prompts are learnable. But in addition to that, so this is based on the co-op paper, but we are extending it to learn two prompts. One is the positive prompt and the other is the negative prompt. Right, so the idea here is to now compare positive and negative prompt encodings with the visual features, which we also aggregate over the spatial positions so that we can find objects that are potentially small in the image and don't take up the entire image. And then finally, we compare the score of the positive and the negative prompt, right? And if the positive score is higher, we predict that this category is present in the image. So
sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that you have about 4 minutes left.
4 minutes left. Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I'll go quite quickly then. So it's very lightweight and efficient because we're only learning prompts. And here we can visualize the attention map from the model that shows that it can actually focus even on the small objects in order to recognize them in the image. So here we're focusing on the dog, here we're focusing on person, and here on cars. Won't go through the numbers here in detail, but essentially we are getting a higher F1 on zero-shot settings, both the standard zero-shot where we're testing only on unseen classes and also on generalized zero-shot where we're testing on both seen and unseen classes. So essentially, like by harnessing the vision language pre-training, we can improve zero-shot multi-label classification by a pretty significant margin. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention is distribution shift. So we're entering this era of supersized models, right? Both in text, we have these giant models compared to what we had a few years ago. In computer vision, our model sizes are also getting larger, and Flamingo, for example, is 80 billion parameters. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to study whether pre-training for it has an effect for generalization and adaptation to new domains. And so what we looked at was comparing existing pre-training methodologies, which uses ImageNet 1K and ResNet, to more modern pre-training, which uses larger data sets, stronger backbones. Also, we compare self-supervised versus supervised pre-training, the size of the model, which data set to train on, and the architecture. And so just to make a long story short, does pre-training and backbone matter? Yes, they matter a lot. So you can see here, these are accuracy numbers of various existing domain adaptation methods that are pre-trained using the standard pre-training. And then just by changing the pre-training with no domain adaptation, we can see that we can get much better accuracy. So I'm going to just go through this very quickly. I apologize, but just want to give you the high level takeaways. So does model size better? Yes. The bigger the model, the better the generalization, both generalization to out-of-domain data and adaptation to out-of-domain data. The architecture picture here is less clear. CNNs and transformers are the two architectures we compared, and it seems that sometimes CNNs do better in certain data sets and other times transformers do better. In terms of the pre-training data set, again, here the picture is bigger is better. For example, ImageNet 22K is better for generalization than ImageNet 1K. But the interesting thing is, if you pre-train on image text data, it can have a large effect on some data sets. So on DomainNet, for example, very large improvement in generalization, but actually hurts on other data sets like Cub. So this kind of pre-training seems to help a lot sometimes, but not always. And then we also tried applying domain adaptation methods on top of this stronger pre-training. And we found something interesting, which is that it was the older methods that actually provided an improvement on top of this strong pre-training, and not some of the more recent state-of-the-art methods. So we think that means that perhaps we're overfitting a little too much to kind of ResNet and ImageNet 1K pre-training, and we shouldn't be over-designing our methods for that kind of pre-training. Okay, so I think I'm out of time, but I'm also done. So I know I don't know if I have any time for questions. I'll thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much for the great talk. You covered a lot of different things, and yeah, I'll reach out to you offline for any questions that I may have. But yeah, thank you so much for presenting.